Have you ever had someone say something about your personality in conversation, maybe even thrown out super casually as a joke because, oh, everyone knows it's true, right? And you suddenly feel like you've had the rug pulled from under you because, wait, what? Something innocuous like, well, because you're the emotional sensitive one of the group. Or, oh, make Katie do it. She's the no-nonsense hard ass here. Or, oh my God, you're so energetic and carefree. Oh, I wish I could be like that. You just don't care what people think. I love that. And you're left wondering, do they know me as well as I thought they did? Or is that what I'm like and I just don't know? Especially when that nugget of your supposed personality is something that you've been running from or feel shame for, or that even feels like it's the total opposite of how you see yourself. That feeling is the start of what we're going to be talking about in this video. A feeling that ends in a question. A question that I think that everyone who has ever struggled this way will be intimately familiar with. Where do I begin and my potential trauma, mental illness, or coping mechanisms end? Part 1. The personality test to existential crisis pipeline. How the hell do you answer something like that? Well, maybe you turn to the go-to method of figuring out who you are in a post-BuzzFeed quiz world, the personality test. From Enneagrams to Myers-Briggs, DISC to 16 personalities, they often cover 3 pretty comprehensive areas: how you perceive yourself, how others perceive you, and how you experience and perceive the world around you. And these tests are everywhere, claiming to be able to reveal the true you, to give you an idea of your strengths, weaknesses, compatibilities, fears, and more. I think their popularity is pretty understandable. They feel like a neat and tidy solution to our desire to figure out who we really are. Because knowing who we are can make us feel less alone, help us find community, be a source of self-understanding and actualization, even be a part of finding a personal or professional brand. This hope that when you finally grasp who you are, you can be the best version of yourself. So let's say you start filling in the questions and it's going well until you hit one where none of the answers fit, or maybe all of them do, or God, it depends on circumstances. Or is it because you're a complex person and these tests are struggling to capture the totality of yourself? Or is it that you don't even know yourself well enough to answer simple questions about what you do and how you feel? So you do your best and pick what you think are the right answers, what you do in this circumstance or that, and you get the results. What happens if they don't align with what you thought you were like? Or when you tell a friend these wrong quiz results and they think it actually matches you perfectly? Maybe you start digging into the history and current uses of personality testing and find out that they are indeed fundamentally flawed, like how they have their origins in military testing for the likelihood of soldiers getting shell shock by testing emotional stability and personality, and how there is evidence of it being used in biased hiring practices and within companies as a reductive method of categorizing workers. And even if you don't change, your test results may well do, with some studies indicating a 50% change rate in retests of the MBTI assessment method after just a single month. We get it, personality tests aren't real, but personalities are, right? So what does it mean if you're struggling to answer simple questions about yourself? Is it that we're all complex and don't fit into multiple choice answers? Or is there a reason why it might be hard for some of us to pin down a sense of self? What if the way that you experience the world and yourself is at odds with what a normal personality is meant to be like? What if you're struggling to answer these questions, not because you're a normal person with a complex personality choosing between different scenarios or hypotheticals, but because you're struggling to pick between the answer you feel you want to give as you and the answer you have to give as something else forces your hand? That has happened to me, and I'm gonna dig more into the specifics of that later in the video. Do I say I prefer a quiet evening to nights out because that's my natural pick, or because I actually have anxiety and that's what is making crowded bars feel unbearable? Am I naturally a cautious person who prefers not to do something risky? Or am I actually depressed and that's why I'm worried that things will end badly every time? To figure out the real me, should I answer like it's one of my best days? Is that who I am without this baggage, or is the best day itself an outlier? If what I said before is true, and what makes us up is how we see ourselves, how others perceive us based on our interactions and behaviors, and how we view the world around us, what does it mean when you can't be sure that what's being perceived is even you? Are people perceiving and interacting with your symptoms or with you yourself? And is there even a difference? If we look at something like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, a pretty well-known theory in psychology looking at what drives human beings, the very top, the source of higher human motivation, is something called self-actualization. It's seen by many as a part of what makes us human, the inevitable step we come to once our basic needs are met. It's about realizing your own potential, developing unique skills and interests, discovering your own values, finding authentic methods of self-expression. If this is the path to happiness and fulfillment, what does it mean if you might have a long-term condition that makes it feel like you don't know the authentic you, or which saps your motivation to develop your skills and interests interests, or which leaves you questioning yourself and your values. And it isn't just about the real you versus trauma or potential mental illness that might have tagged along for the ride. There's other variables as changeable as mood. In the case of mood disorders, like bipolar disorder and depression, there's a special kind of trouble. Our moods colour every aspect of our experiences. When a person is at times exuberant, productive, and impulsive, yet at other times eclipsed by depression and inactivity, it's natural to start to wonder which mood truly encapsulates them. And then you also have the potential influences of coping mechanisms, survival strategies, social pressures, and on top of that, other aspects of brain difference like neurodivergence, ADHD or autism, for example. These have all over the years been seen on sliding scales of self and not self, seen by some as changeable, curable, or treatable, and others as simply aspects of life, whether they're present from birth or acquired later. I want to point out here that in this video, I'm going to be talking about all of these potential things which people might experience as affecting their sense of self, but they shouldn't all be conflated as one and the same. You can have developed coping mechanisms without a specific mental health disorder, for example, with ADHD and autism under what we commonly know as the neurodivergent umbrella for their impact on brain development and function. They're different to depression and anxiety or BPD or other mood-related health conditions, although they might cross over. People could have both at the same time. There are people who have negotiated living with mental health difficulties for so long that it's a seemingly unchangeable part of their personality because it's a coping mechanism that has persisted for such a long time. Many argue there is a danger of this becoming a self-fulfilling cycle. If people in your life think of you as especially socially anxious, for example, they might stop inviting you to events that involve meeting new people, which limits your ability to stretch beyond your current view of yourself as incapable in that area. And it might become a mythos about yourself that you tell to and then start to internalize. I volunteer as a mentor at an LGBTQ+ summer camp for teens, and there's this exercise that we do about the idea of you having your safe zone and then your stretch zone and then your danger zone. And there's this idea of things that are in your safe zone as being something which is going to be able to calm you down, which feels really enjoyable and safe, and which you can use to do things that are more in your stretch zone, things that you're a bit nervous about. And then gradually you might be able to get into things that originally have been in your danger zone that really scare you or that worry you or that seem a little bit too complex or difficult for you. But you have to keep stretching outwards. You can't skip straight to the danger zone. And I think that is like another model of this sort of self-fulfilling circle. If you stick entirely to the safe zone, if you tell yourself, these aren't just things that keep me safe, this is the only thing that I'm capable of doing, it's going to be harder and harder to reach outwards, to explore different aspects of yourself or the world around you, and to potentially be grappling with this question of how far what you're experiencing is innately you. So maybe the personality test didn't help you. In fact, maybe they kind of made things worse. Maybe where do you go from here if you want to figure out who you really are? When you feel like there's a difference between the real you and your behaviors or the way others are seeing you, well, you probably go back to the internet for answers, of course. Part 2, the professional diagnosis. So you've gotten to the point where you're reading a lot of things online and they're maybe feeling a little bit too close to home, and you think you have an explanation for some elements of your personality or your thoughts and behaviors that don't seem normal, and you guess it's time for a diagnosis. Turning to a professional can be a major step in understanding how your brain works, getting you more specialized care, maybe connecting you with a community by starting to accept the inherent neurodiversity of your brain, or maybe you need to seek care for mental health issues that might be causing you harm. This diagnosis is likely to be made by a psychiatrist or psychologist whose background and experience is in diagnosis and treatment. They conduct evaluations, including interviews, assessments, maybe physical exams or other tests to find out if you meet the diagnostic criteria for a specific disorder, as outlined in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, or the DSM-5. If it is successful as you hope, then it's a process that helps you understand a more complex overview of your brain and what the hell is going on in there. For many, there's a huge sense of relief that comes from diagnosis. No longer is there a part of themselves that's a mystery. It can unlock specific help such as medication or treatment options. Diagnosis can assist with developing strategies for more satisfying, productive, and contented life in which the chances of success in social relationships and in education and employment are improved. There's also the potential for this relief to manifest as a kind of self-compassion for a greater understanding of your own struggles. Diagnosed autistic women talk about finding self-compassion as well as compassion towards others through self-knowledge, as well as feeling safer about unmasking, no longer hiding their autistic behaviors in front of others once they have been diagnosed, leading to a greater sense of authenticity. The process of a professional diagnosis can be time-consuming, exhausting, and expensive, and you might not actually end up with a sense of relief at all. In fact, it might be confirmation of something that you have been fearing instead. But for a lot of people, having a validation of a label, even access to different services and accommodations, can be an important step in their lives. But is the word of a professional the only way to understand this part of yourself and your experiences? I want to quickly thank our sponsor in today's ad break, who actually requested specifically to be in this video, and since using them I do kind of get why. Trainwell is this one-on-one remote personal training app, and I would not normally be interested in this at all. I am not a sporty person. I honestly find exercise very boring. However, it was describing itself as super personalized and based in real person accountability and having a specific trainer. I gave this poor woman, Erica, a challenge. Some stuff that I came to her with right from our first meeting was, hey, I have chronic pain and disability issues that leave me bedbound sometimes. ADHD means that I'm going to get bored and super distracted very, very easily. Also, I have some heart issues, which mean that I struggle with traditional ideas of cardio, especially that get pushed on women and girls all the time. Oh, and also I'm the kind of person who has made whole video essays about fat phobia and diet culture and how toxic and dangerous they are, and I'm extremely uninterested in weight loss as any kind of metric of success for working out. And she was like, yeah, that sounds great. So here are just a few of the things that she came up with. First of all, totally on board with the no weight loss thing. On her own profile, the reason why I chose Erica was actually because she specialized in body image issues. Number two, she was like, you talked about liking to go on little walks on nature. Log those in the app. Oh, also a bunch of exercises that you can do lying down and in bed if you feel able to move while you're in bed, although she did emphasize, like, obviously don't do anything that's going to make your pain worse, nothing like that, don't push yourself in that way. A load of stretches that are specifically meant to be good for endometriosis and other conditions that I have. She's so sweet, she's so lovely. So I realized that they weren't asking to be part of this video because they wanted to claim that, you know, exercise will cure your mental health or anything like that. It was more like, because of their one-on-one nature, they have the ability to actually take your own mental health issues, traumas, experiences, disabilities into account in a actually very helpful way. So yeah, you take a quiz and then you get paired up with a trainer, but you can always change your trainer. And then when you have that initial meeting, you can say everything that you may not even have been able to get across in the initial quiz, and really find someone who's going to work for you. So you can take the quiz to find your perfect trainer and then also get 14 days of free training in the link in the description. Okay, back to the video. Part 3, self-diagnosis and social media. There's been an increase in conversations around self-diagnosis as of late, apparently rising out of more people turning to the internet and in particular TikTok and other social media platforms to find out what is going on in their brains. But what exactly is self-diagnosis and why is everyone so concerned about it all of a sudden? Counsellor Jessica Jaramillo writes that, in the simplest terms, it occurs when we assert that we have a mental health condition without confirmation from a mental health professional. Basically, self-diagnosis is you seeking out information about mental health and potentially giving yourself the label of a particular condition. She expands to note that, with the rise of information sharing platforms such as TikTok, this can be done through the anecdotal experiences of others that relates to our own, by looking up the symptomatology, or even by taking online assessments and quizzes. Although this definition specifies mental illnesses, this is also something that's been true for physical illnesses, disabilities, and neurodivergences as well. There can be a lot of complicated feelings within this kind of self-introspection and soul-searching. Shame, fear, curiosity, loneliness. There's a lot to unpack in the constant desire to understand who am I really, especially when it comes to aspects of self which aren't universally seen as positives. Given these mix of feelings, it makes complete sense that we want to find the words to describe ourselves. It feels like human nature to want to gain more insight into the complicated ways that our brain functions. But I think it's important to note that this isn't a new phenomenon, no matter what the Daily Mail would have you believe. TikTok wasn't the advent of self-diagnosis, peer support, and information sharing. As researchers Deborah Lupton and Claire Summerton point out, strategies for self-diagnosis of rare or invisible conditions for people who had been unable to find a diagnosis from a biomedical practitioner have long been developed through peer networks and support groups. It was the advent of the glorious World Wide Web that did facilitate these self-diagnosis practices in a larger way though, because for the first time there was a way to communicate with people around the world much faster and at a much wider scale. The Autistic Archive, for example, is a website dedicated to the history of autistic activism and and community formation in the 90s and onwards. And it highlights a number of online communities for people seeking diagnosis or who were already diagnosed themselves, like the email list Independent Living on the Autism Spectrum from way back in 1996, which specifically described itself as open to people on the autistic spectrum, either officially or self-diagnosed. It covered topics such as advocacy, self-care, and employment, and the list disseminated information and helped others navigate a form of community. But of course, once social media took off, groups and communities formed around these spaces too, allowing for more expansion and connection, with patient-led expertise and advocacy alongside self and peer diagnosis becoming more feasible and accessible. For many, they lived with a list of symptoms or experiences for years, and finding a potential diagnosis was mainly confirmation of a way of being that they already knew intimately. Not just the dry list of potential diagnostic criteria, but also the reality of lived experiences, shared coping mechanisms, that nuanced ways it affects other people's lives that mirror their own. Clinical definitions might fail to connect in the same way as poetic writings of another person with the same condition describing their inner thoughts in a more artistic self-expression. If you're experiencing the same thing as someone with an official diagnosis, it feels pretty fair to many to assume that it's something that they might be diagnosed with as well. For some, self-diagnosis is the first step on a path, a type of information gathering to then take as evidence to professionals. But for others, as historian Erica Dyke and Ginny Russell point out, self-diagnosis emerged out of a longer history of activism and frustration with the medical and psychiatric system itself. Mad Pride, the disability rights movement, the recovery movement, and other consumer survivor movements emerged alongside intellectual critiques of psychiatry and provided a poignant example of people denouncing psychiatric labeling and instead turning psychiatric experiences into sources of insight, authority, and expertise. Other activists have pushed to have self-diagnosis and validation of self-experiences seen as equal or as important to those who are considered experts, like clinicians, researchers, and professionals who themselves don't have these experiences. Many of these people demand a greater involvement of those affected by the conditions or disorders in determining research priorities, policy decisions, and more. After all, these decisions being made are about them. But the criticisms and concerns about self-diagnosis are also far-reaching. While many contemporary psychiatrists are shifting to recognize self-diagnosing as an ongoing and prevalent way that people are coming into their offices, there are mixed discussions about self-diagnosis being helpful in the long run or not. Even doing a simple Google search around self-diagnosis or TikTok mental health will reveal dozens of think pieces, Reddit threads, and academic articles, all trying to unpack what it means to be searching for the self and coming to some kind of diagnosis independently without the official stamp of approval from institutional healthcare. Lupton and Southerton have pointed out that over the past half century, like with the Mad Pride activists in the 60s, there's been increasing tensions between professional biomedical knowledge and authority and the role of lived experience, expertise, and cultures of peer sharing. These tensions have led to concerns about people being taken seriously by professionals, inequalities and injustices in traditional medical settings the same as anywhere else after all, including the potential lack of access that those in marginalised social groups or low-income regions have to expert diagnosis, and the impact that psychiatric stereotypes about what kind of people fit different diagnoses might have on who is given what label. Any issue brought up by young women automatically being diagnosed as anxiety, for example, which I think a lot of us can relate to. I think it's important to point out that expert diagnosis as a form of medical authority can operate as a gatekeeping role, but diagnosis can also take the form of contested and socially constructed forms of knowledge enacted through this practice. For example, what was once diagnosed as pathologies of the nerves or pathologies of sexual expression like hysteria or same-sex attraction are no longer considered medical conditions, as women's struggles for independence and the queer community struggles for equality have been more socially accepted rather than pathologized. It doesn't stop the fact that they were once seen as mental disorders in themselves. A large overarching concern that Jaramillo highlights as the biggest limitation of self-diagnosis potentially is that it can fail to accurately assess a differential diagnosis or comorbidities. In other words, the effective process of being able to rule out conditions that present very similarly or understand how overlapping conditions work and or mimic others. Someone with a panic disorder that starts feeling hopeless about their quality of life can develop depression as well. It was something that was a big part of my own professional diagnosis with ADHD, and especially when I was titrating my medication. They wanted to test stressed that the medication I was already on for other mental health issues, including anxiety and depression, wasn't essentially just masking elements of my ADHD. It wasn't treating something that was going to be treated with my ADHD medication. And so, under the care of a trained professional, I was able to come slowly off of one medication, start the other, and try and figure out if one could do the job of two. It couldn't. I need both of those medications, it turns out. But this argument against pure self-diagnosis as the be-all and end-all is the idea that someone might decide, oh, I have this one particular thing, and then either try and dismiss the other symptoms as all being part of that, or miss them entirely because of this very specific focus on a very specific diagnosis. Practitioners warn that there is a line between self-diagnosis as empowering and falsely attributing symptoms to a condition that you don't actually have. They note that what's different about current self-diagnosis is the fact that we're living in the digital age, where although it's never been easier to get information quickly, you also risk being trapped in reinforcing feedback loops or echo chambers of algorithms, convincing you that you definitely are this or have that, because it's these specific diagnoses being fed back to you again and again. And professionals aren't the only ones who are concerned with the impact of TikTok and social media and self-diagnosis. One Reddit thread in particular is filled with disabled, mentally ill and neurodivergent people expressing that the trendiness of self-diagnosis is preventing them from being taken seriously by mental health professionals themselves. These are just a few, but I think the variety of comments highlights the layers of complexity of seeking and assessing care and who it might end up hurting, while also recognizing that something needs to be done to support people in their lives in a comprehensive way. But a diagnosis, professional or not, is not the end of the line for questions of personality and self. Part 4. So can a diagnosis tell me who I am then? Sure, a diagnosis allows you to at least partially separate symptoms from your sense of self, splitting it into you and your disorder or condition. But who's to say that the condition itself isn't also you? It's in your head, after all, where you make sense of the world. It can affect how you see yourself and others, how you behave and interact with people around you. Isn't that who you are? I mean, maybe not in the sort of higher philosophical sense that I'm honestly sure that Abby of Philosophy Tube has talked about before on this website, but in a very practical sense. Does it matter that some pure, unaffected personality exists innately inside of you if you never actually seem to experience it or act like it? When it comes to negative symptoms, especially when they affect others, this gets especially messy when looking at the idea of blame and accountability. If you have depression and agoraphobia so bad you struggle to leave the house, can you be blamed for flaking on friends or never showing up for them when they need you? If the mood swings caused by a personality disorder make you become angry or argumentative with a partner, even if they know it's not how you really feel and you apologize, does the hurt caused override that reason? I think a lot of people would say, no, it's still that person's fault. But I guess I would question whether they would say the same thing about a physical ailment. If someone was like, hey, I actually have a crazy migraine today, I'm so sorry, I'm going to have to flake on you, I'm not going to be able to come. I think a lot of people would just reply with, oh, I'm so sorry, are you okay? Can I do anything for you? And I guess it's that question of what is different about something which is inside of your head. Again, it all comes back to that sense of the fact that we see what is inside of our brain, our way of processing things, as being about our innate inner sense of self. And so to a lot of people, it feels different. It feels like an excuse. It feels like something that if it's in your mind, surely you can just push through or work past. Especially because who's to say that the unreliability or being quick to anger elements of these disorders are even a result of the disorder itself? Maybe they are just an unreliable or angry person anyway. Maybe they are a little selfish. Maybe they use the diagnosis as a crutch, whether consciously or not. When it comes to neurodivergence, questions of self are at the forefront of the language used to describe it. These conversations around person-first language, the idea of saying person with autism rather than autistic person, are all about the idea that the two can be separated, and that separation is a good thing. Person-first language has been rejected by many autistic people themselves, specifically because they reject this separation and its roots in what they see as a sense of shame that they should be feeling around autism itself. But I think a lot of the arguments about neurodivergence and self-diagnosis, in particular criticisms of people talking about their experiences online, is this idea that there is something bad about people making their whole personality being autistic or being ADHD. I think this undeniably comes from ideas, whether again conscious or not, of these things being something negative. That people describing themselves this way is somehow reducing themselves to just one thing, as if that thing isn't something that affects a lot of their lived experience of the world day to day. To me, it's no more worrying than someone placing their sense of self around their job or their place in their family, for example. Interestingly, there have been studies studies of personality traits and their connections to diagnoses of ADHD and autism, for example. ADHD and autism spectrum disorders are associated with specific temperament configurations and an increased risk of personality disorders and deficits in character maturation. Adults with ADHD significantly differed from controls across nearly all TCI personality domains. On average, adults with ADHD endorse more novelty-seeking, harm avoidance, and self-transcendence, and less reward dependence, persistence, self-directedness, and cooperativeness. Addressing personality traits in adults with ADHD may lead to improvements in quality of life and reductions in functional impairment. Well, if that's true, I guess the question is, does knowing part of your personality might be there specifically because of your ADHD make it any less a part of you? Does it make it any less authentic than any other part that might have been due to hormones in the womb, or a genetic quirk, or your early years environment, or any other random uncontrollable thing that determined who you are now? Mental health and psychological diagnoses are largely based on the aforementioned DSM-5, a collection of named and described conditions and disorders. It determines not just the name of collections of symptoms into like a diagnosis, but in many countries, including the US and UK, can also determine economic and health policy. Specific conditions allow for specific prescriptions or benefits or insurance access. It gives a sense of a scale of these symptoms and in turn can focus resources on those seen as a widespread problem. As I mentioned earlier, the DSM-5, originally categorized being gay or trans as a mental illness until reasonably recently. Like, it's clear that the science here, like a lot of science, is affected by social norms. The DSM's take on mental health is not the only model questioned either that's currently being used. Psychological models of personality itself are honestly in constant flux. Currently, the 5-factor or big 5 personality traits are particularly widely accepted, it seems, based around an observation of how our own language clusters adjectives around personality into 5 main subsets, the idea being that these 5 subsets are the basis of each person's personality. Openness to the new. This is about how far you're curious, enjoy new experiences, and are open to new ideas. Conscientiousness. This is about how organised, reliable, and diligent you are, often with an adherence to rules, goals, and norms. Extroversion. This is about your preference for social interaction, often leading to an outgoing nature and the tendency to be stimulated by contact with others. Agreeableness. This is about your tendency to be friendly and open, with a trusting and cooperative way of interacting with the world. Neuroticism. This is about your tendency to experience negative emotions such as fear or sadness, and leading to you being more prone to instability and stress. So when I read about this, big 5, I was like, okay, yeah, that's a neat way of categorizing people. But surely there are other traits that might be missing from this list. 5 seems like it's quite a limited number. And that is the case. A very well-known one that people have proposed to be included is honesty, humility. So the tendency to be fair-minded, sincere, as opposed to self-centered or manipulative. But for me, there's also questions of things like how you're driven, whether you have a high need for achievement or high standards for yourself, or how you see the world and your place in it, whether you're optimistic about life in the future, or given your level of self-esteem or self-worth. Surely these are all aspects of personality that can be hugely important. But also, these traits aren't singular traits on a scale so much as a bunch of traits in a trench coat. Like that description I gave of conscientiousness, for example, being organised, reliable, diligent, adhering to rules, norms. Just because someone is reliable doesn't mean they're organised. Just because someone has a strong adherence to social norms doesn't mean they're going to be diligent. And yet, all these ideas come under one singular trait. I'd also say that inevitably social biases will come into play here now as well, and not just what is considered a agreeable or honest, outgoing person in the society you're in, but also how positive those traits are considered. The more I look at psychology of personality, the more it seems like a D&D character sheet, but taken much more seriously and with a much more profound potential impact on actual clinical treatments, therapies, and policies. Because you look at yourself through this 5-point lens and you decide you're a conscientious extrovert with neurotic tendencies, and oh wait, it's a personality test all over again. I remember learning about theories of attachment in infants way back in school and in university. And the biggest takeaway that I got from these experiments was how much the norms differed between cultures. A baby might be labelled as perfect, the most healthy form of attachment in one country, but then abnormal in another based just on their attachment style because of the way in which that society viewed different ideas of attachment. I did this workshop online when I still worked at Penguin, the publishers, and it was one of those HR things that they make everyone do, and it was meant to be about concepts of privilege, but the people running it also for some reason included extroversion as a privilege. And it was really interesting going into the breakout breakout rooms and listening to, because it was publishing, a lot of middle-class white women talk about this in like almost in like an excited way, like, oh my God, yeah, those extroverts, they are more privileged because they probably speak up more and so they get their ideas out there and people probably take them more seriously. And it was so obvious to me as someone who has studied and been interested in and talked about a lot things like intersectionality that, yeah, sure, to you, being an extrovert might be a step up. But if you were to take the same behavior of being someone who is outspoken and gregarious and who is making their voice heard in meetings, but make that a Black woman, the way in which misogynoir works in our society means that her extroversion may well be seen as, in a lot of spaces, something inherently negative. Ultimately, the DSM-5 and other psychological labeling and research is based on observing people outside of the norm, studying how these behaviors or symptoms appear and in what combinations. And when enough people show the same combination of something that is outside of the norm in your particular culture, it might get a name, and that becomes a diagnosis. And this model of psychology and psychiatry has been criticised as reductive before. Almost half a century later, however, the emerging picture is of overlapping conditions, of categories that blur rather than stand apart. No disorder has been tied to a specific gene or set of genes. Nearly all genetic variables implicated in mental illness have been associated with many conditions. A review of more than 500 fMRI studies of people engaged in specific tasks found that although brain imaging can detect indicators of mental illness, it fails to distinguish between schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depression, and other conditions. The DSM's approach to categorization increasingly looks arbitrary and anachronistic. And so we can see how even a definitive diagnosis is not so much a concrete truth about yourself as it is a categorization based on our current language and social attitudes. But the symptoms, they are real, however we end up labeling them. Is the key to finding out our real selves a journey of healing then, of treatment, of therapy, of recovery, whether from a specific diagnosis or just in general from these particular symptoms? Not so fast, gang! Part 5, fear of treatment. I want to talk about something here that I think is steeped in stigma, more so than a lot of mental health issues themselves, and that is the fear that many people feel at the idea of getting better. When someone has access to resources, to funds, when they are handed the key to treatment and a path to recovery, why might some people still hesitate? I think from the outside looking in, it might seem ridiculous. If you're supposedly suffering, why wouldn't you jump at the chance to change that? But I think that these questions we've been asking of self and personality and internal struggles can start to illuminate why. Recovery itself as a concept is complex and often dependent on the person and the condition or circumstances they're in. For example, recovery from an eating disorder will look different from recovery from a manic episode. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration has described it as a process of change through which individuals improve their health and wellness, live a self-directed life, and strive to reach their full potential. Which feels quite open-ended. Improve your wellness, strive to your full potential. Aren't we all trying to do that already? How do you know if you have done it successfully? Gotten rid of all of this baggage and illuminated the real you? Well, clinical recovery, that is recovery involving healthcare institutions or practitioners, might make goals, aiming to be symptom-free for a particular length of time or for a short period, or even just being able to cope with your symptoms better. When I had a breakdown in my second year of uni, classic, I didn't go take myself to the doctors. At first because I couldn't get out of bed to do it. It was part of my physical depressive symptoms. But even if the doctor had made house calls and had appeared magically in my bedroom, I honestly still would have had a part of myself that feared it too much. I want to talk about why this happened for me, but also why it might happen to other people for totally different reasons. Because although it might be surprising to the just don't be sad contingent of mental health crisis deniers, there are actually so many reasons why getting better isn't an easy journey to start. Let's first look at fears around the process of recovery and treatment. I've had some kind of anxiety-related illness for as long as I can remember. I've talked on this channel before in my video about OCD about how my very first memory is of an obsessive intrusive thought. It's awful to deal with. But here's the thing. Until I reached that crisis point at 19, I was struggling with it in my own desperate way. The fear of entering into recovery was also a fear of the unknown. There is a safety in surety, even if what you are sure of is your own illness, your own suffering, because I knew I could cope based on my experience of coping up until then. What happened if I tried treatment and that's what I couldn't cope with? One of the best places online to find real, genuine openness around discussions of mental health, I think, is ironically enough Reddit. Although there have been studies and surveys about mental health before that are, written about and peer-reviewed, I think the anonymity and culture of Reddit may well provide us with some of the most honest writings about people's experiences. They've decided to reply in their own time without having to know a researcher is going to pore over their answers, and with the ability to pick the threads that speak to them and compel them to share without anyone having to know who they are. On the topic of recovery fear, one user admitted, "I'm going through a particular stage in trauma therapy and I feel like I'm disintegrating. My beliefs, priorities, relationships, personality, nothing is certain. It's tough and distressing, and at times I can sense that I'm on the very edge of losing it and falling apart." That lack of a sense of self at all is very real, especially for those who have trauma from their early life or childhood experiences. This is also particularly true for those with long-term, potentially even lifelong conditions, which mean that recovery is more about management than a cure model that we might use for a physical health condition. The individual must redefine the self over and over in light of the ongoing and ever-changing nature of the mental illness condition itself and society's response to it. One Reddit user that I saw spoke candidly about their fears, not necessarily that they would lose a sense of self, but that in gaining clarity of who they really are, that they would hate that person. "I'm afraid that while getting help and guidance for navigating my disorder may make me a happier person, it won't make me a better one. I pretty much fall into the quiet type of BPD. I turn everything inward and devalue myself. I know my maladaptive strategies have negative effects on my family. I'm a married woman with 2 kids, and I'm not always successful in hiding how miserable I am from them. But I'm afraid that if I start to think of myself as a more worthy person, I will become selfish and won't give as much to others as I do now. I don't want to become even more of a burden on the people that I love than I already am. I'm also afraid that by going to see a therapist, I'm taking a space from someone else who needs help more than I do." In these cases, it isn't just the negative elements of personality that are ascribed to the mental illness, but the positive ones too. I think from the outside it feels clear that someone so concerned with others in multiple ways in such a short message is unlikely to end recovery as a fundamentally selfish and uncaring person just because they found a medication or treatment that alleviated their symptoms of suffering. But it's clearly a real fear, right? And the root of that fear in stigmatized attitudes to their own conditions has shown to itself be a major hindrance in recovery. As one group of researchers explained in their work on illness identity, assuming that mental illness means incompetence and inadequacy impact hope and self-esteem, which further impacts suicide risk, coping, social interaction, vocational functioning, and symptom severity. These then not only lead to avoidance and poorer psychosocial outcomes, but also may be a factor that sustains symptom severity, leading to a vicious cycle. These negative assumptions about those suffering with mental health symptoms are widespread. I've spoken about the way that media representation has shaped our understanding of these conditions more than once on this channel. Another participant in a 2015 piece of research gave her own lived experiences to the researcher as part of an interview. One participant even felt that the media had played a role in her friend's diagnosis of her. "I had a friend who said I was a psychopath because I had a personality disorder, and that frightened me to bits. I said, gosh, I've never wanted to harm anyone. She must have heard it on some TV program, you know?" Fear of recovery can also be about the mechanisms of treatment itself. For those suffering with psychological illnesses, our cultural idea of what treatment will entail is tinged with frightening imagery and discourse. The idea of being sectioned, of losing control of your life and freedom, of being mistreated in asylum-type facilities. Staying in the equilibrium of controlled suffering at the hand of your own mind, to some people, feels better than surrendering to the possibility of being locked up or forced into a treatment that you didn't agree to. This same study, which asked participants about their recovery-based fears, found this lack of agency was a recurring concept, including the possibility of losing their independence, jobs, or even their children. One participant described needing someone to talk to during crisis, yet feared being given medication. Consequently, he did not contact services. "I don't want to be in a situation where I can be forced." And of course, this is particularly an issue for those already being mistreated at disproportionate rates by the healthcare system. Another participant believed that as a large black male, staff perceived him as a threat and treated him accordingly. He recounted seeing a small white man acting aggressively without consequence. "If that had been me, they would have given me medication and pinned me down." That idea of being misunderstood or judged may be present for many people in general, but the fear of it in those suffering mentally is particularly pronounced. If something is wrong with your brain, the fear suggests, people might doubt anything and everything you say. Maybe you'll doubt yourself. Psychotherapist Jennifer Gerlash wrote about her own experiences on her blog. "I struggled with a sense that a switch flipped after I and those around me learned of my diagnosis. Where was the line between sadness and depression, nervousness and anxiety, confusion and psychosis, happiness and mania. For a time, I felt that I had lost the right to some of my basic emotions, lest all my reactions be pathologized. And then there's the fears around the validity and quality of the help that is out there, because this lack of support in traditional frameworks of healthcare has been, of course, noted by companies and tech startups who have made businesses out of accessing therapy, diagnosis, and medication. On the surface, it seems as though this could be a positive. After all, access to a doctor in many countries could take months, even years to access. It's increasing access on demand through something as simple as your computer or phone. If you're in a rural area or have mobility issues or simply don't have a health practice to go to, having access to services online could be life-changing. However, researchers are digging into these subscription models, asking who is behind these apps and services that are targeting people who simply want to have more clarity in their lives. Many of these tech startups have been accused of exploiting the vast need for remote mental health care without due diligence, reportedly leading to inadequate client care and poor working conditions for therapists. There's also the fact that major therapy platforms have been fined by the Federal Trade Commission for selling user data and accused of deceptive advertising practices on social media. So potentially they're doing more harm than good. And fear of the process isn't the only barrier to recovery. There is, of course, the fear of going through this process and ultimately failing at it. If you try and fail, what does that say about you? That you aren't strong enough? That you didn't try hard enough? Or that your trauma has damaged you beyond repair and now you're back to where you started with even less hope? Or maybe you were always going to fail because you can't recover from your own innate personality and flaws. This fear that being so depressed you can't function, so paranoid you doubt everything and everyone around you, so anxious that you paralyze yourself, that those things are just you. And finally, we come to the last fear associated with recovery, possibly the hardest to open up about, the fear that it will work. Think about what we've already discussed in this video about the ways that personalities and self can intertwine with mental health issues or differences. If you feel like your anxiety is part of you in some way, then in recovery, you're destroying that part of yourself, right? And that is scary. If someone's coping mechanism involves being the joking life of the party, would recovery make them boring? And on the other side of stigmatized mental health myths, there's also the equally damaging idea of the tortured genius, that suffering is necessary for great art and expression, and it's some superhuman way of viewing and seeing and feeling the world. A lot of creative people struggling mentally worry that recovery will take away a kind of intangible spark that they have, and others worry about losing positive things that they've managed to claw from their experiences. It feels like the only thing that I can hold on to. I'm afraid I'll forget or minimize my own suffering and might even lose empathy for people who are suffering because of healing. I know this shouldn't be true, but sometimes the thoughts are still there. If you have friends or family who have stuck with you through your illness, then it's scary to have to realize how you might have mistreated those friends and family due to your symptoms, but then also the process of reckoning with the guilt of you not having recovered earlier to spare them that. But more than that, the fear that you get better and yet they are disappointed with who you are at the end of it. Part 6. Are mental health crises inevitable? Even in the UK, where physical health care is available for free in pretty much all circumstances, psychological care feels much harder to access quickly and without spending your own money on therapy or private diagnoses. Which I think brings up the question. If people are anxious about the costs of treatment, which I think people would agree are a reasonable response to prohibitive pricing and unaffordable healthcare, might their anxiety about other things, the anxiety that they are seeking treatment for even, be just a logical response to the world and their circumstances? I welcome you to the obligatory Rowan Ellis segment about how the video has been 3 capitalism critiques in a trench coat this whole time, because I think that a rise in mental health diagnoses that we see at the moment are, yes, partly because more people are aware of symptoms and feel less stigma around diagnosis itself, but also because the world is a little bit on fire and modern technology means that we are aware of every bit of it all of the time. The issue of youth mental health in the wake of the COVID pandemic was highlighted by the Surgeon General in 2021, for example. The pandemic era's unfathomable number of deaths, pervasive sense of fear, economic instability, and forced physical distancing from loved ones, friends, and communities have exacerbated the unprecedented stresses young people already faced. It would be a tragedy if we beat back one public health crisis only to allow another to grow in its place. I think this is also also a key element, right, in our questioning of if these potential symptoms of anxiety, depression, or hopelessness are our own personalities, or more accurately, our own personalities struggling to cope with the world around us. Now, I know that there have been many the youth are all soft cucks, naysaying middle-aged opinion column writer who points at the First World War, or the Second World War, or the Vietnam War, or just war, and proclaims that we're all pathetic softies nowadays, completely forgetting shell shock and PTSD and his own middle-aged repressed emotions that he never shows anyone, including himself. I understand the idea of looking back at the good old days where people ploughed the fields all day and didn't complain and never took a mental health day, and comparing it to the cushy life of an office worker who gets to sit down all day and do LinkedIn and spreadsheets for a living without risking their lives. Like, surely we should all be grateful and mentally fine. But I think there is something in the nature of much of our work nowadays that exposes why we might be struggling. Obviously, ideas of socialism and capitalism, the works of Marx, for example, are seen primarily as an economic proposition. But I think when you engage with them closely, they are ultimately psychological theories just as much. The ideas of alienation, emotional labor, searching for the meaning in production, aren't these all ultimately about how we feel about work, not just about the physical task itself or the specifics of the money involved? I wasn't sure if I wanted to share this in this video, but I think it just feels very apt that I'm working on this video right now while going through my own mental health work issues. When you make YouTube videos for a living, your income depends primarily on the number of views your videos get. Not how good the video is, not how many hours you spent on it, not how excited you are about what you have to say or how important it might be. It's just how many people watched it. And that is something that you can't control. You might try and mitigate it by setting up a Patreon, for example. Mine is incredibly helpful for me and my work, but unless you are one of those creators who can use direct audience support for their full salary, which I can't right now, the algorithm is king. It's taken a while for me to articulate it even to myself, but I'm finding that I no longer necessarily feel a sense of excitement when my videos perform averagely or even well. Instead, I just feel relief. Whereas if they underperform, I feel such a strong sense of panic, anxiety, and dread. My work is, mentally hard, but isn't dangerous. It doesn't break my body. On paper, it's, a dream job a lot of people want. It has so many elements of education and research and writing and curiosity that I love. And yet, this uncontrollable element of it has the power to absolutely crash out my mental health on a monthly basis. It's because it is a textbook ultra-modern example of this critique of capitalism that centers around so many of us feeling so out of control, that it isn't about doing your job well, that a company will still see you as expendable. It doesn't matter if I create the best video of my career, it might still not get enough views for me to get the monthly income I need because YouTube has the monopoly on long form video content. I can't go anywhere else. There's no funding beyond brand deals and sponsors who aren't necessarily going to be interested in the quality of your work beyond being good enough at getting viewers. My views for the last year have been slowly declining to a point that makes this as a career feel more and more untenable. That is a reality that I am really having to reckon with in the next few months. And that, I would say, is a reasonable thing to feel anxious about. Yes, people might be working in a nice office job at a nice desk, but they are staying there for hours after their contracted time, often to get the job done. They're making decisions and running projects for ultimately just earning a company more money, knowing that that company they work to benefit doesn't really care about them. They've seen redundancies in their teams. They're spending hours commuting, sending emails late at night, spending so little time with friends that they end up trapped in catch-up cycles of socializing. It's this lack of purpose, lack of certainty, lack of agency, lack of community that's surely having an impact. Does it make sense to pathologize people for very real fears about making ends meet, being able to pay their bills, being worried about their futures? How far are these common issues of anxiety or depression just an understandable reaction to modern life? Even more like serious conditions of obsessions or dissociation feel newly familiar if we looked at them through the image of like a shopkeep smiling with no actual feeling of happiness because they're contractually unable to express any of their internal feelings. Is that not itself tied up with ideas of repression or dissociation? Has the old idea of leisure time as a way of exploring passions and making work hours worth it potentially given way to time off as a form of recovery from work itself, where passive passive consuming of entertainment is more achievable than anything else? Is it possible that many people display symptoms of mental health issues are just having a very normal reaction to their circumstances? But it's easier for the wider systems and ironically our own sanity to decide it's all individualized, that the suffering is individual and so is the cure and the reason behind it. I've had so many stories of people being offered group therapy to address a round of layoffs at work and things like that. These initiatives don't give us access to power. They only serve to make us feel better about the structural conditions we live under while also framing them as inevitable. I do think to some extent this can affect people regardless of their income level, but the current cost of living crisis, let's be clear, it's not exactly bloody helping. Not knowing whether you can afford food is not exactly conducive to a non-anxious mind. If you're anxious all the time about money, then is that a disorder or just a depressingly inevitable part of many people's lives? The Joseph Rowntree Foundation has pointed out that the energy price cap fixes bills at a level already unaffordable for many. 7 million low-income households have either gone without enough food in the previous 30 days or gone without at least one essential, such as a warm enough home or basic toiletries, because they can't afford it. 3/4 of these families have gone without more than one of the essentials we asked about. A third have gone without 4 or more. As of August 2022, in Scotland, a large number of people were going without basic essentials. 28% of people have lost sleep due to financial anxiety, rising to 2 in 5 young people. Over a third, 34% of households with children, and more than half of those who are unemployed or unable to work. Even the most optimistic soul is going to struggle under that kind of pressure. Money in many ways allows you a great opportunity to find out who you truly are. That self-actualization thing, not only opening up passions and opportunities, but fundamentally giving you the choice to see aspects of your inner self without the track before the train pressure that gives little time for slow self-reflection and possibilities. A lack of funds not only creates an environment of practical stress, but also makes mental health care harder to access. Not just institutional care, but personal coping strategies. In one report, the Mental Health Foundation concluded that positive coping strategies, contacting family or friends, going for a walk, maintaining a healthy lifestyle, and keeping up to date with relevant news were consistently more accessible to those in the higher socioeconomic bracket compared to the lower bracket. Remember at the beginning of the video where I said I was going to talk about an instance of a friend of mine saying something about my personality and me being like, wait, what? That's how you see me? My dear and precious friend, fellow YouTuber, can't believe I'm about to name and shame him, Taha Khan, a third of Answer in Progress, an angel, one of the best people I know, once referred to me as having toxic masculinity. It was funny in context, but what he meant by that was the idea of like, he didn't see me as a particularly emotional person. He didn't see me as a particularly affectionate person. And that was so interesting to me because I had always considered myself to be extremely like tactile, extremely emotional. And what I realized was that was a version of myself that I was thinking about from my childhood, from my teen years, and up until I was around the age of 19 or 20 years old, which the detectives amongst you might have realized is the age that I went through my crisis, my mental health crisis, and had treatment. I had a treatment that is known as talking therapy, CBT. And this to me is a combination of everything I've talked about so far in the video. The idea of types of recovery and processes of recovery, the idea of like, is mental health just kind of inevitable? And this real complicated idea of like personality and self. Because it turns out my experience of CBT gave me more long-lasting, I would say maladaptive coping mechanisms than my mental health disorder itself. The idea behind CBT and talking therapy a lot of the time is this sense of this anxiety you're feeling, this fear or this depression. It has its roots in useful mechanisms of fear for back in the day, in the Stone Age era, when a big saber-toothed tiger was running towards you. Yes, it made sense for you to go into fight or flight mode. It made sense for your adrenaline to go up. But what we're experiencing nowadays when we experience these kind of anxiety and adrenaline spikes is not a tiger who's going to kill you, you know? And I think that this sense of minimizing the experiences and the pain and suffering has quite a profound effect on many people. These types of therapies have been criticized by a lot of people because what it essentially does is it gets you to a place where when any strong emotion comes up, you are trained to downplay your own response to it. You are trained to say, it's not that bad. You're not dying. You know, it's not the worst thing that could possibly happen, so it isn't that bad. And ultimately what that can do in some circumstances is mean that any time you are feeling what should be a valid emotion, a circumstance where you should feel sad or betrayed or anxious or fearful, you are so used to persuading yourself that that is not a valid thing to feel that you push down on that feeling. And especially when you've experienced a type of depth of mental health suffering, it is so scary to be on the edge of that, to feel like you're starting to feel an emotion that feels like it's too close to what previously had tipped you over the edge into this pit, that it's way safer to just not feel it. And this to me is the key endpoint of this idea of pathologizing feelings. It can be useful, but it can also be something that leads to these treatments where the idea is that what you are feeling is not valid. What you're feeling is abnormal. It is something that needs to be treated, the feeling, rather than the reason behind it. I think this is part of why the Just Talk About Your Mental Health campaigns are nice sounding, but insufficient when it comes to reality, when it's all that we seem to be given. They emphasize just talking, just to a friend or colleague, as, you know, the be all and end all of mental health, rarely acknowledging that this alone doesn't necessarily help with mental health symptoms anyway, for so many reasons we've talked about today, particularly because they give little to no guidance or support for the person on the other end of the conversation, whose friend or family member has just opened up about their mental health, maybe even in a moment of genuine crisis. Most people aren't equipped to deal with that themselves, let alone anyone else, particularly someone that they care about personally and are like deeply worried about getting something wrong. For some people, talking about their mental health is intrinsically tied to talking about their trauma, and these are often the people most in need, yet are treated as an unwanted afterthought in the images of friendly chats over cups of tea. When it comes to questions of personality and self, they almost always fail to acknowledge the specific stigmas behind mental health issues that might have things like psychosis-based symptoms, instead focusing on the more mainstream ideas of anxiety and depression as "I'm feeling a bit down" type conversations. For some people, talking to someone close to them is an important first step in accessing tools of recovery or treatment, but the lack of resources, provisions, and support for every other element of that journey is a real fucking problem. And just talking won't change that. Because fundamentally, mental illness is a civil rights issue, not a bullying issue. And these campaigns often ignore the lack of resources, abysmal waiting times, that see people with these symptoms going months to be seen by someone who might actually be able to help, and that funding and support for the NHS and mental health charities is vital to make this happen at all. And in this way, it ends up focusing the impetus on the person suffering to open up and offer up their pain and to admit to it when questioned, while not providing any safety net when they do, or implying that they did something wrong if they don't. Since announcing on my social media that I was going to be covering this topic in a video, my god, I've had so many people message to say that they felt this way for a long time. I've questioned this internal Venn diagram of self and other over and over, but I haven't felt able to express it because they felt that others wouldn't understand, because they worried that they were just trying to make excuses for their own failings, because they were scared of admitting that they had such a loose hold on their own sense of self. It feels like a different conversation than those advocated for in these twee mental health awareness ads. Something more intimate and personal and vulnerable than the vagaries of, "Are you doing all right? Where do I begin and my mental health or trauma end?" And maybe that is a conversation that is worth having. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. As I mentioned in the video more explicitly than I normally do, I do have a Patreon. If you are interested in supporting my videos and this kind of like independent research, please consider supporting. There are a bunch of perks that you can get if you do support, including care packages, postcards, recommendation lists of things that I've watched and seen, articles I've read, stuff like that. So please do check it out. And finally, thank you once more to today's sponsor, Trainwell. You can take the quiz to find your perfect trainer and get 14 days of free training at the link in the description.